Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for another edition of Connecting the Dots podcast. My name is Emeka Opara with Next Year Power. Today we'll be talking about off-grid solar solutions. When we say off-grid solar, a number of things come to mind, from standalone solutions in your house that give you power to more productive uses for solar for irrigation and things of that nature. So we'll be covering a wide spectrum of that today. I am happy to welcome Mr. Patrick Tonui, who is Head of Policy and Regulation and Regional Strategy for GOGLA. He will be joining us today to speak a bit about the sector. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Emeka.
So in Nigeria and in the West Africa region, there's obviously a need for off-grid electricity given for the region. There's around 40% of the region that do not have access to power. In Nigeria specifically, that number goes up to over 50% of Nigerians, around 100 million Nigerians, do not have access to power. So there's been some really innovative solutions around getting power to those people, but there's been some obvious challenges in getting that done. So I would really like to know from your work at GOGLA, who work in the sub-Saharan Africa, could you give us an overview of the market? Giving us the overview of the market would be great to understand how the rest of the region compares to sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you again, Emeka, for having us. Maybe first let me start by introducing GOGLA, who we are. GOGLA is the Global Association for the Off-Grid Solar Industry. We are 11 years old. We were founded in 2012 in the Netherlands, and we and our members are really the private sector response to this challenge of delivering energy access to communities who live beyond access to the grid. Most of these communities tend to be in sub-Saharan Africa and will really be rural. Generally, their income levels are quite low, and they live in hard-to-reach places. If you look globally, today, the number of people without access to energy globally is about 800 or 700 million. The bulk of those, about 600 million, live in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow.
And of that, there are two countries that contribute about 2/3 of that number, and that is, 1/3 of that number, and that is between Nigeria and Ethiopia. So really solving that energy access problem in Nigeria will go, a significant way or an important step towards really addressing the number of people without energy access today. I think it's interesting over the last 3-4 years, the progress that has been made in Nigeria in addressing this issue. We as GOGLA collect market data from our members twice a year. And if you look 4 or 5 years ago, in fact, even up to 2 years ago, we noticed that you were seeing a lot of progress in reaching off-grid communities in Eastern Africa, in India, but there was really very little progress in West Africa and also in Nigeria, where Nigeria had this real big need for addressing this off-grid energy access, but the market just was not growing. But I think with deliberate action and some of the steps that were done, for example, the adoption of the NEP program, over the last 2 years, we've seen a significant upscaling of that, where before Nigeria was, not in the top markets or the top places that we're seeing growth in this. In our last data that was just released earlier this month, we saw Nigeria is now second only to Kenya in terms of the number of solar home systems that are being delivered into the market. And if you look at the NEP data, they're talking about in the last 2 years of the program, they've reached about 1.4 million households, which is an important step. It's still a long way from reaching the 100 million Nigerians that need energy access. But when we look at our data, where there was nothing happening before, you're seeing that things have woken up quite a bit. So that's really, I think, the global picture and where things stand. There's still a lot of work to be done if you're going to make sure you don't leave anybody behind. But at least we've started.
That's a really good overview, because if we look at the power sector in Nigeria, there's a number of issues. And the biggest issue from our point of view and from the market's point of view is market illiquidity, because there's not the willingness to pay is not where it should be. So a number of distribution companies on the on-grid side suffer with commercial and collection losses. Could you take me through how those issues are mitigated on the off-grid solar side, if they are? And if they are mitigated, I would love to know how they've been mitigated, or is it a challenge that you're currently dealing with?
Okay. I think it's a really good question, and I would actually add an additional element there. There is a question of willingness to pay, and there's also the question of ability to pay. I think globally, and if you look at the people who've been working on energy and energy access, first, you've got to recognize that while energy access was for a long time a purview of public utilities, governments and utilities just don't have the money needed to reach everybody. Therefore, if we are going to reach everybody by 2030, you have to find a way to tap and get the private sector involved. And on the standalone side, or particularly the systems that we and our members sell, all of this is primarily delivered through private sector companies that develop the products, manufacture the products, sell them to customers, and provide the after-sales service and support to those customers, where they actually become mini utilities in a disconnected manner. So in terms of what you're talking about, which is willingness to pay, when we look at the market, right, the way our industry first started was looking at what do the people currently use for their energy needs. And for example, in the beginning, when they were trying to determine if you give a solar home system or a product to a customer and you want them to be able to pay for it slowly, because they would not be able to buy something that they need on a cash basis. That would extremely limit your market. So we tried to look at, and the companies tried to look at, what were they using for their current energy needs on a daily basis. And for a lot of people, it would be kerosene or something like that. And they tried to match that so that the cost of acquiring this solar system was not going to be more expensive than what they were using. And that started looking at what we call the addressable market, what you can reach in a commercially viable manner. But when we now look at those who are left unreached and unserved, these remain our poorest communities in most of the countries. And I'm sure this is pretty similar in Nigeria. And also communities, especially if you live on, you're dependent on agriculture or some of these other economics for your livelihood, which means you also don't have a steady source of income. Your income patterns may be dependent on harvests and things like that. And therefore, it's not even a question of your willingness to pay, it's your ability to pay for this, but will last very many years. So for us, we are seeing that there is populations and communities you can reach by driving down the cost. But then there are others that even if they are interested and they want the product, they are not going to be able to afford it because they are poor, they have very irregular income patterns. So increasingly, we are seeing that to leave no one behind, we will actually need to go back as a matter of public policy and say, can you subsidize this cost the same way you're subsidizing the grid, so that you provide these communities with power, with access to energy solutions that is of the quality that you want, that is able to also enable them to do what you need with power. You don't just want to deliver light. You want them to be able to use that power to, have a radio, have a TV, run a fan. I think when you look at, for example, a fact of life in quite a bit of Nigeria, where if it gets too hot during certain seasons, and with climate change, heat is going to be a problem that will also affect people's ability to live. You need to also enable them to have a fan or something that cools them down. So we do need to do something about subsidizing that cost for them.
It's a really good point. What would be interesting to know is, on the other countries that GOGLA has worked in, how has government been able to get involved with helping to subsidize some of these people who are off-grid?
So I think reaching everybody, there are some interesting examples that have come out, and I'll share some of that with you. For example, in terms of particularly where you try to subsidize the cost for those least able to pay. I think one of the examples we've seen is in a country like Rwanda, where they have a really effective way of, through their national data on their population data, they have identified what they call 5 categories. They call it ubudehe of income levels within their communities and their population. And you start off with the poorest, who would be orphans or people who are survivors of the war who have no other sources of income, and then it goes up from there. And what they've done in Rwanda is, for the really poorest, because they have a really strong social system and they're able to identify those households, and they've, you've got a culture that's quite responsible. The government has committed and is providing energy products to those at the very poorest for free, right? Or at highly subsidized 90% rates. And then as you go up the income ladder, then the subsidy level decreases until at a certain level there's no subsidy because you have the ability. But it's really underpinned by strong national data that are able to identify and target specific communities. On the flip side, there was a program that was done in Togo where essentially rather than targeting, they essentially said everybody's open to a subsidy. So they subsidized for everybody so that it's non-targeted. That also had quite a robust impact there. So that's a different approach that can be done. We've seen some models tried in different countries. For example, in Kenya, they also went to look at who's on their social support programs. So the elderly, orphans, people like that. And essentially, because they already knew that these were people that were on social subsistence from the government, then it's also using other sources of public data to target those communities. We are seeing some work that, for example, that is beginning to be experimented in places like Malawi that look at, based on district data, you look at what are the income levels in a specific district or in a specific jurisdiction. And therefore, if you already know that jurisdiction is quite poor, that means you would know that those are where you apply. So it's more geographic or location-based approaches to it. So I think there's multiple mechanisms that would allow you to do that. We've also seen that there are different approaches where you can either do it as direct vouchers that go to the consumer based on who you target, and then the consumer is able to go and pick from different providers as they want, or you can put it more on the companies, where the companies report back data to the government on who they've been able to reach, and then they turn around and do the verification, and then the subsidy or support would come now to the company as a subsidy for the people. I think if with commitment, we should be able to figure something out, what works and what's most applicable for the Nigeria circumstance. But it is doable. It's not easy, and it may not be able to solve it for everybody, but I'm pretty sure for different sections of the community, we should be able to, we can start off with some of the low-hanging approaches.
That's some really important points. One thing that I take away from your statement is everything boils down to data.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have data, and unfortunately, we don't have the proper data to really be able to get these things done. Because if you now go back to that, I believe it was the Malawi example around what people are earning, that means your tax authority has to be involved, right? Because they know what people are earning, and they're now able to postulate who will qualify for these programs. So it's a lesson learned on our end that we really need to get our population data in order to be able to really know where these 100 million people are, because they're definitely out there somewhere. So as we move into the Africa and the sub-Saharan Africa point of view, how do we ensure that most of these connections are now moved towards productive use? Because I have a theory, and I guess it's probably one that's widely accepted, is once you're able to provide a family, a household with productive use for a solar, what could happen is the family now has access to financing, because now there's a way to earn money, and that money now goes into the economy and it expands further out. But if you just give that family access to a light bulb is great, but all you'll end up happening is you get to a point where they now start wondering, can we really afford this light bulb? But if it's used for productive use, there's a pathway where there's access to more money, and it can go around.
In fact, I think you're really on this next frontier that everybody on energy access is now really asking themselves, right? So providing a light bulb is important and great, but it's not a place to stop, because the whole essence is you don't just want somebody to be able to see, but it's what that energy access represents. It's the ability to do something with it. And we are really glad to see that there's been a lot of innovation that's happened, because that's enabling, especially the solar power, to be able to pump or to do certain things. Now you're able to access, for example, a solar pump. And with a really small solar pump, especially for smallholder farmers, if you've got a quarter acre of land, half an acre, an acre of land, and you've got access to water, you can now pump and irrigate your crop throughout the whole year. Cooling solutions that have come, and it applies to fisheries and multiple sectors. I think the big question that we're seeing is, as the technology matures, and for some it's absolutely matured, it's how do you finance that? Because when you move away from lights to now making sure that the end user or the small business has access to this product, these are even more expensive than the lighting solutions. And we need to really solve that challenge of how do you provide channels for people to be able to afford and buy those products, which means in new innovative financing mechanisms. How do you lower the cost of capital? How do you bring on board, for example, the microfinance institutions and the SACCOs that they use to be able to understand and say, yes, if I'm already financing you with a small tractor or a motorbike, I will also finance you to access a small water pump. And really building up this pipeline so that somebody who wants a product but doesn't have the cash is able to afford it. And today there are products, especially when you look at some of the cooling and the pumping, that if you're somebody who's dependent on rain-fed agriculture and you're on a small or even larger scale, there's a solution out there for you. But do you know that? How do you find a good quality product so that you don't buy something that, this is one of the challenges we have, where if you've got substandard products in the market, it hurts a consumer, it hurts a market, it just undermines all the goodwill and the good faith in the product.
So in Nigeria, I feel like probably even most of West Africa, I feel like a number of mistakes were made back in the late 90s with solar. A number of solar products came into Nigeria that were labeled a grade A when there were more or less solar that was good for the day of lunch, and then afterwards the solar stopped working, the panels stopped working, batteries X, Y, and Z, and a number of Nigerians lost faith in the solar products. That's why when you talk to the average Nigerian around power and you mention solar, they'll tell you, oh, that thing doesn't work. It's those cheap things from Asia. Those things don't work in Nigeria, but obviously they do. It's just a matter of the grade and quality that we've had in the system has not been as fantastic or as great as they should be. So I think it's probably, like you said, public awareness needs to increase, and it's something that we've done here at Next Year and through a few different channels. The Enlight series, where we've been educating Nigerians on the power sector over the past 6 years, doing different things such as this podcast and also columns on national dailies in country, and also through our media arm of the firm called the Electricity Hub. So that's something that we as Next Year would love to partner with GOGLA on, if it's something that's amenable to what you guys do, and also just being able to tell that story from a local point of view, not from a very international base that you should do it. We should be able to have ideas and examples that show that a small water pump is actually possible for people who do rain-fed agriculture.
Yeah. In fact, I think, we're a firm believer in the need for standards, and in many ways we are actually encouraging governments to not only adopt standards but also enforce them. If you see, for example, many of the solar home systems and solar lanterns, they actually have warranty periods, minimum 2 years warranty. And not only that, they should also be able to meet certain performance standards, like at least a minimum of 4 hours of light every day. So which means if you turn it on at 6 p.m. in the evening, you should be able to get to 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., especially at the highest level of power. And then if you use lower settings, it'll go much longer hours. We've done, for example, working in Uganda with the association there, and if you go to a country like Ethiopia, where through a lot of consumer education, now even the consumers expect that that product will meet those standards and there's meaningful warranty. We believe in not just warranties that are written on paper, but meaningful warranties, and we let the customer demand for it because it's something that we've encouraged, and it's actually written into the IEC standards and the Lighting Global standards that we've encouraged all our members to adopt.
Wow, that would be a very unique opportunity here in Nigeria because everything you buy is buyer beware because of just some of the issues that most retailers have had. So this is good to hear that that's working in other countries. So I'll get you out here on this last question around what's the outlook of the space in sub-Saharan Africa. We know that 600 million Africans do not have electricity. What's the outlook for the next 5 and 10 years, and how can government help meet those targets?
We've made progress, but we're not doing enough, right? So from our data, we know that if we're going to reach everybody by 2030, we need at least $20 billion a year coming in terms of investment into the sector. And this investment needs to reach companies from the global ones, but down to the local firms that need that capital to buy inventory, right? Or to grow their businesses and expand their distribution networks. We don't have enough money. And of the money that's coming in, it's not reaching everybody that needs to access that data. We've seen our data last year showed that about $700 million of investment came into our space, but we still see a very high level of concentration into a small subset or the largest firms. But we know we can't reach everybody if we don't make sure that there's enough money for everybody, and both at the global level, but also down at the local level. We also know that we really need to do more to unblock and deal with this affordability challenge. And what do I mean? For example, we know in most countries, if you apply import duties and customs, would be at the equivalent of 40% plus of the cost to deliver to the customer. And if we're really trying to reach and make sure that you who's living in, beyond the grid can afford, then even the government and everybody else needs to support so that you're creating pathways and channels for people to be able to not only get or access a product, but to be able to afford it. I think we also need to do more to make sure that we are much more inclusive. So really looking at how we also bringing, the women along in terms of that they can, if you're a woman-led household or, you're a woman in doing business, that you can also access these products, and we create channels that are also responsive to how women need to access those products, what they can do to pay those products, and also be able to come into the industry to sell and deliver, so that train women so that they can also go up on the roof and install these products. They can do it as well as the men, so that it's also inclusive.
I know we're out of time, but I can't help myself to ask this last question around opening up the floodgates, as you mentioned. What sort of capital would you be looking for? Would it be philanthropic capital, or would it be banking funds from banks, or would it be government subsidies?
I would say all of the above. I think to reach the very poorest, we'll need either philanthropic or essentially subsidies, right, from the government, because they can, so that we don't leave them behind. If they have to pay the full cost of the products, it's like saying if you pay for the line to your house, you pay for every pole and everything to your house. We know most places you just pay the connection cost, the rest is up to the government or the utility to provide. So we need to do that. But beyond that, it's working capital cost. So if companies have access to working capital at really competitive rates rather than exorbitant rates would be, I think, quite important.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, and thank you for this very informative and also just eye-opening session, because when we think about the off-grid space in Nigeria, and West Africa as well, we think about the financing that is needed, and I personally are troubled because, like you mentioned, those people will not have access if we on the on-grid side and people who have the knowledge can go and advocate. And we know that without electricity to those people, the economic indexes, like the GDPs of most of these countries that are stuck in this trap, will not rise. So it's important that we figure out a way to get more power to these people, figure out the financing mechanism that's required to get this done. But I believe government will have to listen, because the days of focusing on one commodity as a way to finance your whole economy has gone, and it's time to now get into more productive uses to be able to move some of these people who are unelectrified to having access to power. Thank you, Patrick, for your time. This has been a really informative and also a session that I really wanted to go different directions, but we ran out of time. So we'll try and do better the next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.